Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Bev Jackson of LGB Alliance, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the first Gay Spot webinar of 2021. Just a couple of words on why we call these monthly webinars the Gay Spot. The name was chosen as a tribute to the Black lesbian pioneer Ruth Ellis, who died in October 2000 at the grand old age of 101. Ellis and her lifelong partner made their home in Detroit a refuge where Black same-sex couples who were not welcome anywhere else could dance, sing, and socialize. And their house was known as the Gay Spot. Dance, sing, and socialize. We hope to capture some of that spirit in our webinars. Our topic today is everything you wanted to know about gender dysphoria, but were afraid to ask. Gender dysphoria. What is it? Does it exist at all? And why is it suddenly affecting so many more girls than boys? In a complete reversal of 10 years ago. And why are we discussing it here? Is it an LGB issue? Those are some of the questions that have been asked on social media since we announced the subject. And I think our panelists will have plenty to say on those and other matters. You're welcome to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and the panel will answer as many as possible. The webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel afterwards for the benefit of those who missed it or who want to see it again. So let's meet our fantastic panel. First up, Dr. Az Hakeem, a consultant psychiatrist with decades of experience treating patients with gender dysphoria. He recently published his book, Trans, about which one reviewer said, "This book is likely to equally delight and upset both the born in the wrong body and the born in the right body crowds." This, almost by definition, suggests that the book is quite balanced and non-judgmental, which is exactly what you should expect from a thoughtful therapist. Next, I'd like to introduce Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist and the presenter of the documentary Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, in which she interviewed a number of young people with gender dysphoria and reflected on her own experiences with the condition. The documentary is described in one review as a step in the right direction towards a proper conversation about the issue of gender. I'm also very happy to introduce two women who have kindly agreed to discuss their own experiences with gender dysphoria. First, Carol, a 40-year-old lesbian who's joining us from California. Carol first experienced gender and sex dysphoria starting in her early teens. She identified as a trans man from ages 34 to 38, but has since detransitioned. She's one of the co-founders of detransvoices.org, a platform dedicated to providing information, resources, and community for detrans and desisted people. And I hope Carol will explain the difference between detrans and desisted for people who are new to this subject. And we're also very happy to welcome Lauren, the co-founder of LGB Alliance Ireland. Lauren has written for The Radical Notion and other publications. She's a butch lesbian who lives with sex/gender dysphoria, as she calls it, and I'm sure she'll explain that. Rather than transition, she says to love the skin you are in, love the skin you're in, the slogan according to which she lives and under which she campaigns. So welcome to all of you and to all those who are attending this webinar. It's a very, very full crowd today. We're all very happy to welcome you. And I'm sure it's going to be an interesting discussion. So let's get started. And let's start with Az. Perhaps you could tell us how and why you first decided to specialize in treating patients with gender dysphoria.
Well, Bev, thanks very much for having me. So the way I got into it, well, I didn't have a gender dysphoria myself, but I suppose I grew up in a very small Welsh rural town, and my family in the 70s when I was growing up were the only brown people there. So everyone was very white, very Welsh, and we were the only brown people there, but I didn't know any brown people. And I remember when I was about when I first went to school, when I was in infant school. I remember coming home and saying to my mother, um, I I think I'm just like everyone else. I don't think I should be brown. I feel like I'm just like everyone else. And obviously the task for my mother at that stage wasn't to say, oh, you're trans ethnic, I'm going to give you ethnic cleansing. The task for the parent then was to help little Az understand, and widen the repertoire of what it meant to be brown, rather than these stereotypes I saw in 1970s television. So that was sort of the first sort of incongruity of identity for me. And then I could never decide whether to do medicine or fine art. And I applied for both, and I got into both. And the day before, I almost tossed a coin. I thought I'll do medicine. But I was very interested in sculpture and art. And I remember I used to think, sex changes were this wonderful invention, this wonderful sculpture. And my next decision was whether to do psychiatry or plastic surgery. And I managed to get the professorial health job in plastics at UCH. And I remember helping the surgeons, being this very minor, lowly house surgeon, do these very complex gender reassignment operations. And I was thinking, on the one hand, this is amazing sculpture that we can do this. But then I was thinking, well, what's happening in their head? What's happening in their mind? Because the surgeons were just purely looking at it from an anatomical, sculptural point of view. And I was thinking, what's happening about the mind? So I went into psychiatry, and what I found was that no one was thinking about the minds. They were just sort of sending them to surgeons. I was thinking, well, who's thinking about this? And because no one was thinking about it, I almost like decided to become this sort of pioneer. I wanted to think about it. And, I suppose if I'd gone into psychiatry and no one was thinking about schizophrenia, I'd probably gone into that. But everyone was thinking about schizophrenia, everyone was thinking about depression, but no one was thinking about gender dysphoria. So I got interested in that. And then when I got my training post in psychotherapy, I was very lucky, and I was at the clinic that they said, you're here for 5 years as a specialist registrar, you can do what you want. I'm sure it's changed now. And so I inherited a therapy service for preoperative transsexuals in those days, and I inherited a service for postoperative transsexuals. Those were very depressed, and the preoperatives were very excited. And I amalgamated them together, and I set up a specialist gender dysphoria psychotherapy only service, which I ran the whole time I was in the NHS until I left in as to how I got there. And because no one else seemed to be doing it, then it fueled me to sort of write papers and research and do all that stuff. Is that okay?
Thanks, Az. That's really it's really fascinating. I love hearing the way in which you saw the surgery as a kind of sculpture is really fascinating. Well, we'll be coming back to you in a minute or two, but let's now hear from Stella. Stella, what was it that drove you to get involved in this subject? And please tell us about your documentary.
Well, I, as a kid, from as far back as I can go in my memory, had a very intense experience around gender, and it seems to be what would now be described as gender dysphoria. Insofar as I really, really needed to be a boy, I wanted to be a boy, I felt I should be a boy, and that had anything been right in the universe, I would have been a boy. And I still actually think I would have been a good boy, better boy than perhaps I was a girl. But it was very difficult for me, and it was very distressing for me, and it lasted many years. And they often say the phrase insistent, persistent, and consistent to describe whether somebody really should transition. And I certainly was all three of those. And I had it from in and around the age of 3 to in and around the age of 10. From about 10 onwards, it went into a very dark place. And I always think that, God, if I had had any sort of notion of puberty blockers, I would have swam oceans to get them, because puberty was so very difficult for me, and it was very, very dark. But I did come out of it, and ultimately I became happy in my own skin, in as much as any of us are, and ended up being a mother, and I'm married, and I love being a mother. So I've really seen the gifts of being a woman in my old age. And I've always looked at trans issues as a result as very much of a road I could have taken, very much of I know that feeling. And so I looked at the media probably that bit more than most people. And I often write, I'm a psychotherapist. I became a psychotherapist quite late in life, and I often write for the media around that, mental health and stuff like that. And I knew I had something to contribute, because I noticed that there was an explosion of articles in the media around trans, And none of them seemed to give any sort of narrative towards the kid I was, a kid who kind of had very intense experiences and grew out of it. And they were talking about things like trans kids. And I was like, well, hang on, I was technically a trans kid. So where am I fitting in this? And I wrote an article for the Sunday Independent. And as a result, I was asked by Channel 4 to do a documentary. And the premise of the documentary, which was called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, the premise was, could it be that among the 4,000% spike in children presenting with gender dysphoria, could it be that any of those kids are me? And could it be that any of those kids would grow out of it if they weren't given intervention, or would grow out of it if they were given psychological intervention? And could medicalizing those children be problematic insofar as there doesn't seem to be room for people like myself? And while I knew when I entered it that this was going to be very difficult, and all my friends told me not to and don't go near it, this is too incendiary a topic, I felt I did have something to say, and that there might be children like me. And I had been very distressed and I needed to add my voice. I was astonished at the level of the block, the complete shutdown, that nobody who professed to talk for trans kids and trans people wanted to discuss whether it could be possible that people like me would be in part of their groups. And I'm talking from Mermaids to Stonewall to the Tavistock to All About Trans Media Watch, everybody. We approached everybody. And, you know, Ollie Lambert was the director, and he has 30 films under his belt. He's won Emmys, he's won Grammys. He really is very well respected as a war zone, funnily enough, working mostly with war zones. And I remember him saying to me that a friend of his who also works in war zones, when Ollie told him that he was working on this film, the other war zone documentary man said, you're a braver man than I am. And he was right, because it was unbelievable, the backlash that we got. And he said later on, after Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, Ollie went on to do a film about Israel and Palestine, where he was talking with the spokesman and the media for the IDF, and also talking with the people for Palestine and Hamas. And those sides were prepared to talk, and those sides expected both sides of the kind of the debate, the discussion to be addressed. And yet he found it much harder the year before, in 2018, when talking about trans, that one side would not, and tried valiantly to shut us down, contacted Channel 4 to shut us down, did massive attempts to stop that documentary going ahead, which had, I would argue, quite a thought-provoking question that needed to be addressed.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that. This whole issue of silence, and also, of course, your own psychotherapy, in which you treat people with gender dysphoria, and just the reactions also to that documentary. So many interesting things. I also wanted, but I'd like to move on a bit, because both Az and Stella have made it their professional work to focus on these issues. But both of them. And I think this is interesting, actually, we're able to relate it, the work, to their own feelings in childhood. But let's move on now to our other two panelists who have found gender dysphoria to be a very challenging experience and have dealt with it in different ways. So Carol, could you tell us about your experience with gender dysphoria and how it changed over the years?
Okay, yeah, thank you for having me as well. I first really started experiencing it in my early teens, once puberty started in. It was very, very difficult. When my breasts started to develop, I pretended that they weren't doing that. And I really just, I hated it. I hated my menstrual cycle. I hated everything. I really felt like I should have been a boy. I really identified with boyhood and maleness, and that's where I saw myself represented, it seemed like. And, you know, that obviously started at a much younger age, identifying more with, you know, what I saw men doing and boys doing. It was around puberty too that I started to realize that I was same-sex attracted. And that also kind of made it, it made it a lot worse, because I came from a very homophobic family and I had no frame of reference for gay people. And I started to think of myself more as a boy, because in my head, only a man could be with a woman. So I really connected it there as well. And it just kind of, this kind of fantasy, this kind of dive into going away from reality just got worse over the years. And in my early 20s, in the lesbian community, when I was first out, it seemed like just overnight, suddenly all my butch friends, my butch lesbian friends, suddenly started identifying as trans men. And I'm like, what is this? I'd never heard of that before. And one of my friends told me about it, and I identified so much with that. It checked all the boxes. And it was in the early 2000s that I started to identify as a trans man as well. And I did pursue transition then. At the time, though, the gatekeeping was pretty stringent, and I couldn't meet the demands that was asked of me. It was impossible. So I just kind of dropped it and let it go, but I kept inside. My own identity was a trans man. I didn't expect anybody to see it, but I felt that way. And it wasn't until my early 30s when my life kind of disintegrated for other multiple reasons that my dysphoria just became overwhelming. And I thought, I have to do something about it. And I went to a therapist and I said, I think I might be trans. I need help. And she was an affirming therapist. She never questioned anything and almost kind of encouraged me. And I ended up transitioning at 34, thinking that this would resolve the issues I'd had my whole life. Come to find out 4 years later, it really didn't resolve anything, because it was more the outside, not really inside me. And a lot of introspection and some therapy and working through a lot of my stuff as a childhood and my internalized homophobia really resolved a lot of my issues for me. And so that's why I'm active now, trying to raise awareness that, like, why aren't we given other options as dysphoric people?
Well, thanks. That's really, really interesting. Especially, I want to come back in a minute to this notion of gatekeeping and how that's changed, because I think that's really fascinating. And of course, how this is an LGB, why is this an LGB topic? I'm sure that we're going to be talking about that. But now let's move to Lauren. Perhaps, Lauren, you could tell us something about your story, and you live with dysphoria now, and what's that like, and how has that changed for you over the years?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me on the webinar. And okay, I'll start from the beginning. I was born in 1980s in Northern Ireland and grew up in the 80s, 90s here as a working class female. I was very much, as a child, a tomboy. You know, that's what you would have described me as. I was constantly getting up to my eyes in muck and climbing trees and BMXs and skateboards, and I very much had a lot of male friends, and like Carol said, I was very much comfortable in the presence of the boys. And I noticed during the time of growing up in Northern Ireland, because it was quite a religious culture, in the midst of all the unrest, there was a negative impression on anyone who was gay, lesbian, bisexual. Anyone who was different was frowned upon. And it was never my family who I got these examples from, but just society in general, that it was somehow unacceptable. And that's kind of the message that went into my head just before I start. So I didn't really, I didn't conform to gender. I was gender non-conforming from as young as I can remember. But my distress around my body and dysphoria really began at age 10 properly when I first got my period, and it felt like I was going to die. I didn't know what one was. I didn't know what was happening to me. It was really distressing, and it was the onset of changes in my body, physical changes, emotional changes that I had no control over, and that, for me, was deeply upsetting and disturbing, because before that I was used to controlling everything, being able to do what I wanted, go where I wanted, when I wanted, and all of a sudden at certain times of the month I couldn't swim, without it being incredibly embarrassing. And I started to develop breasts, and I suddenly wasn't like the boys anymore, and I felt like, as a result, I felt like I was almost made wrong. There was something wrong with me, because I wanted to stay like that. I wanted to stay being like one of the lads. I wanted to be able to continue doing the things that I did, and I couldn't. And so at the same time, I also noticed emotional changes. I didn't like the same things as girls like. They talked about boys a lot. You know, they started to get boyfriends when we were a little bit older. And I was interested in girls. From previous experiences and previous things I had heard, with this being an unacceptable thing, for me, it was surrounded with guilt and shame to be a lesbian. Before I even really understood what a lesbian was, I knew I had feelings about girls and I liked women and I thought they were pretty. So I stayed silent. I didn't tell anyone about my feelings. I didn't tell anyone about my sexuality. I just kept it all quiet. And it all got messed up with how I felt about my own body. I would say my feelings about, my negative feelings about my body intensified because as my body started to develop from age 10, I also noticed that particularly men became interested in me. And, you know, I got chatted up in a swimming pool once at age 10 because I had large boobs. And it was very uncomfortable for me and it was unwelcome. And I didn't know what to do with any of that. I felt extremely vulnerable. And one of the ways in which I tried to compensate for that vulnerability was to develop physical strength. But ultimately, I was emotionally very vulnerable. And during my teen years, I tried to sort of reach out. I tried to find other people who were like me. I tried to sort of see if there were any lesbians out there. And we just happened to have the internet, finally, the old dial-up kind of internet that made an awful noise. But what I didn't understand was when you go on the internet, there is internet safety to consider. And so being a vulnerable person, being not worldly wise, I happened to be groomed. And it led to extremely negative things happening in my life and very, very negative sexual experiences as first sexual experiences. And this all then fed back into that negativity about how I felt about my body and the distress around my body and my female parts. And I just didn't want anything to do with that. That continued until I was in my late teens, early 20s, and I met my wife, who I've been with ever since then. And that's when things began to change for me. That's when things started to take a positive turn because I met somebody who accepted me, apart from my own mother and my sister, etc. I met a person outside of my family sphere who loved me, not despite who I am, but because of who I am, because of how I behave, because of how I love, because of how I express myself, because of all of that. And you can't underestimate the power of somebody who really loves you. And she's also very clever and very, very good at talking about emotional things. And my wife suggested to me that I should seek therapy, which I did. And it was only really when I sought therapy that I began to understand that I had a thing called dysphoria, because I didn't really know until I was late 20s, early 30s, that this was even a thing, that I had it, that I wasn't diseased or, you know, something wrong. I wasn't wrong. You know, I was absolutely okay. This was okay. I had a name to call that distress, which was incredibly helpful for me. A lot of people say that the word is overused, gender dysphoria, sex dysphoria is overused. But for me, it helped me to break down and clarify and understand what I was going through.
Yeah.
And it helped me understand really that I don't want to be a man, ultimately, that I want to love who I am.
So there was a moment at which, and it was first the love and then the therapy that really kicked in and moved you onto this new path. As when you're listening to these two stories of these two women, do they sound similar to the kinds of people that you've been treated? I mean, I presume there's a lot of difference between the men and the women who have gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and I think what I found quite quickly is that I came into it with a number of assumptions and presumptions, and I came from a psychoanalytic background, and I'd read what early writers had written about it, and to be fair, they based their assumptions on like 5 case studies. And what I found over the 20 years that I was working with these people was that the patients really were my education. I learned from them rather than some book somewhere. They taught me everything that I learned about gender dysphoria. And what I came what I believe is that gender dysphoria, or the confusion or the unhappiness about one's gender, is a symptom. I don't think it's a disorder that's all the same. I think it's a bit like a cough. You know, if you have a cough, you might have something stuck in your throat, a sore throat, pneumonia, lung cancer. So the arrival at a position where you're confused or unhappy about your gender may come from lots of different routes, and everyone was a bit different. There were some similarities. There were some subgroups which had similarities.
I mean,
but
do you
everyone
recognise
was
the
different.
stories, the stories that you're hearing from Carol and from Lauren?
Absolutely, totally. And the story of the internalized homophobia and the not knowing what to do with it, and the identity that doesn't seem to be right or valid or allowed, and then trying to sort of morph oneself into something that is valid and is allowed. You know, so there's a common theme often of an external framework that one feels that one doesn't fit into. And then rather than saying, well, that framework's no good, it's saying, well, I must be no good because I don't fit in that framework. So what can I change about myself to fit in that framework? So that's quite common.
It's interesting, Stella, that Az is talking about it as in terms of a symptom. And I was thinking, because you hear people say, oh, it's not really a thing, gender dysphoria, it's just a reaction to a political reality. Why medicalize it? Why do you have to medicalize it? And I was thinking, is it like anorexia that people say, oh, you just have to snap out of it? Do you think that that's a good comparison or not?
Yeah, I think it's a great comparison. I think there are similarities with the progression and the way it manifests, and often the self-loathing and the harsh critical voice. There's an awful lot of commonalities between anorexia and gender dysphoria. There's also an awful lot of commonalities between gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia, which doesn't seem to get highlighted enough. And if you were to put the two together, you could get gender dysphoria. If you were to, say what actually is gender dysphoria, I'd say it's a combination almost of those two. And then, I'm not really mad into diagnosis, because I think people hang an awful lot on it, and then when they see it, it can be really clarifying. And like, I think Lauren gave a very good example of how it can really be very, calming to hear about it. And yet on the other side, some people think just because I've gender dysphoria equals I should medicalize. And I'm like, well, we've got an awful lot of things, an awful lot of distresses, an awful lot of diagnoses. We don't have to medicalize them all.
Yeah.
We don't have to medicalize nearly any of them.
I remember that after your documentary that you were saying that you had dysphoria as a child, and people said, oh, well, that wasn't real. That wasn't real gender dysphoria. You're just making it up. You're dramatizing yourself. Well, how did you react to that?
Yeah, I'd like to know how they could tell. How do they know? I'd love to kind of chat with them. Did they meet me in Blanchardstown in 1984? Because if they had, it's very notable that anybody who did meet me kind of went, oh yeah, I remember you. Because and that's what it was very interesting that, psychologists and, who have worked in gender dysphoria said, any child with gender dysphoria, it, because they sing it from the rooftops. It is quite evident who is, it's quite evident. And I was very well known as that. Like the first question I was asked for my entire childhood was, are you a boy or a girl? And I never answered it. I didn't even know how to answer it. I was like, oh, I'm not, was my answer. But yeah, I think it's such a dismissive thing to say, when actually we live in a world where if you say you're a woman, that they could kind of somehow leapfrog that point to jump over. And yeah, by the way, Stella wasn't trans. It's like, okay, massive contradiction is happening there.
Yeah.
That's queer theory, though.
Yeah. Carol, at some point you decided to detransition. How did people react when you did that? Were people supportive? Was that did people understand what you were going through?
No, no, it was not at all. Obviously, my wife was very supportive and was my rock with that kind of thing. But I contacted initially when I decided I needed to detransition. I contacted my endocrinologist and I told her I want to taper off of testosterone. I want to detransition. And she goes, do you not want to do the shots anymore? Do you want to do the cream instead? No, I want to stop. Well, maybe you should see the psychiatrist or the psychologist. I'm like, now they're asking questions. It was very different than when I went to transition, when I went to transition, I didn't really get too many questions from the medical community, but when I went to detransition, I got a lot of questions. So yeah.
And you're saying that people were very positive about the transition and quite negative about the detransition.
Well, I noticed a big difference in the way the medical community responded. Now, my personal life, my family and stuff, they were just really confused with the transition thing. They were just like, okay, whatever. With the detransition, the same pretty much, except like my wife's side of the family were very supportive with my transition, but with my detransition, nobody said anything. No one said, wow, this is crazy. How are you doing? Anything like that, which is just kind of weird. I mean, I think I appreciate her dad, because my wife's dad said the best thing when we went over and told him I was detransition. He was like, oh, that sounds about right. Let's go out and have dinner and celebrate. And I liked that, he was just like, he was like, whatever, that's great. But everybody else was really confused. But yeah, the medical community was a big difference for me. I was like, well, now they're questioning my sanity because I want to detransition. It was very odd.
And what about the trans people you had known while you were a trans man? How did they react?
Oh, well, I was never that into the community personally, because I always acknowledged my biological sex, and I'm a bit more based in reality, I think, than a lot of people I was around. So I didn't find I fit very well in the trans community. So I really wasn't have that, but I did have a trans guy friend I was really close to, and I tried to keep a relationship with him, but he just split. I mean, I don't think he could take the fact that I detransitioned, and he kind of looked up to me too. So I think that was part of it.
Yeah. Lauren, I was thinking, I remember you saying the other day that talking about the fact that you went through pregnancy. And I was I was quite startled to hear that, because I think a lot of people would think that if you have trouble with your body as a woman and you go through the kind of the most female thing that you can go through in a way, pregnancy and childbirth, how did that affect your dysphoria?
For some reason, I did always want to have children. I wanted to have kids and a wife and a family. And I did have a child. It gave me a period of relief, actually, from my dysphoria, because although during pregnancy you have, your breasts enlarge to prepare for breastfeeding, etc., I lost my periods. And for the first time, really, the things that were happening to me, to my body, had a purpose. I could say that, well, yes, this, my breasts are getting larger, but they're developing milk. That milk is going to sustain life. It was obviously lovely to not have a period for about a year. That was great. Loved it. Wish that could have continued, but unfortunately it didn't. And I have the sort of dysphoria that is persistent and consistent. So the sort of distressing side of it returned, but it was really nice to have that sort of break. And it was one of the things in my late 20s, early 30s that gave me a further understanding of the positive parts of my body. I always had framed them negatively previously, and now they had a purpose. They had I could give life. It was a really beautiful kind of experience, and it
But the
made me
dysphoria came back again afterwards.
It never left. Parts of it were relieved, is what I would say, but I suppose it never left. I've always had it. That's just the way it's been.
I was thinking about this thing that Carol was talking about, gatekeeping, and how that has changed over the years, about how difficult it is to go through transition. Can you tell us something about how that is in the UK, the gatekeeping process?
I mean, in the UK, that you get referred to, as soon as you mention anything about gender dysphoria, you get referred to the specialists who deal with it, the gender clinic. But I've sat in on gender clinics just to get a good idea of what happens, and you basically go there, and they go, it's very superficial. They go through a tick box list, literally, of asking questions and ticking it off, a bit like some sort of laminated sort of, and the person there usually has an idea of what outcome they want. And all they do is they research on the internet, what you need to do to get to the next level. It's a bit like Sonic the Hedgehog or some sort of game where you've got to give the right answers to get to the next level. So you go there and you convince them with this pre-prepared script, and then you get seen every so often. It's usually every 6 months or so. And all you've got to do is persuade the gatekeeper, the psychiatrist, that you still want to have a sex change, that you haven't changed your mind, and you're very determined about it. And you may want, it's another question as to why I'm referring to a sex change. I have a reason for doing that. And then every 6 months, as long as you're still wanting it, and they've ruled out that you're not psychotic, and it's not because you're hearing voices, then you have the hormones, and then you have the surgery. So it's very, very, very superficial. I think there's a big difference between a gender clinic, which is literally just tick boxing. All they've got to decide is it's not secondary to some sort of psychosis, and you still want it, then we'll give you what you want. Whereas I was seeing people every week. So the people I was seeing every week analytically, and some of them I saw for 12 years. So it was quite in depth. It was such a privilege to get inside their head and look around with them and try and work out how it was. I liken it to maths, and I was terrible at maths. And if ever you were unfortunate enough to do A-level maths, you often have to simplify an equation. And if you're me, at some point, you get something wrong and go off at a tangent, and your answer is completely way off. And it's a bit like that with the people I was talking to, in that there was this underlying something's not quite right, which then, for whatever reason, they pinpointed it on their gender. And going back to the anorexia thing, the anorexic pinpoints it on their weight. And being, as a psychiatrist, I've treated anorexics and gender dysphoria. And the anorexic, you look at them and they're skeletal, but because they've decided that it's their weight or their body size that the solution is focused upon, they really focus on that. Whereas the gender person, it's their gender. We're a constellation of variables: height, weight, gender, age, sex, whatever. But for gender people, it's their gender. They're determined to do this. So the gatekeeper is just sort of letting you pass the next thing. Whereas the first thing I would say to my patients is, look, I'm completely separate from a gender clinic. You may be in a gender clinic as well, but everything you tell me is confidential. You can be as ambivalent, as undecided as you want. You don't have to convince me of anything, because you'll never get anything from me apart from therapy. And they were able to be more relaxed. And often the first meeting, they'd come up with this, very familiar story. And I'd say, just stop, start again. I've heard this all before. Just be honest. Just tell me the real version. Then they give you the real version, which is, completely interesting, rather than, oh, I like rough and tumble play, I never like all this sort of pre-prepared script.
Thanks. Stella, I wanted to ask all this therapy that Az is talking about, and of course you also give psychotherapy. There's a tremendous move at the moment to call all this psychotherapy, the idea of giving someone who's got gender dysphoria psychotherapy, is now, there's a move to call that conversion therapy. What do you think about that?
I think it's a very shallow understanding of what it is, conversion therapy. I think we're a lot more, anybody who works in a gender clinic is a lot more at risk of carrying out conversion therapy towards homosexual people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual, than they are of it's like, it's the cleverness of words that some people use to carry out campaigns, and they're turning it on its head, because an awful lot of people who are same-sex attracted end up gender non-conforming. An awful lot of them in this era, in this kind of symptom pool that they're swimming in, they end up with gender dysphoria and a wish to transition. And really what we're dealing with is internalized homophobia, and often internalized misogyny from the girls as well. And that's what we should be dealing with. And they've misappropriated the word conversion therapy. Conversion therapy comes from a terrible place where they were electrocuting, giving terrible drugs to people who were gay way back in the 50s and way back before then. And to turn it on its head, that gentle, explorative, compassionate, psychodynamic therapy could be on any level construed as conversion therapy is so wrong-minded it really makes my heart beat faster. On that subject, though, just to talk about gatekeeping, I do think there might be an argument to say that maybe gatekeeping is inappropriate for exactly the reasons.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Stella? Because we lost you a bit there. We lost you there. Could you repeat it?
Oh dear, am I going out?
Yeah, we just lost him a bit.
I think there might be an argument Yes, I think there might be an argument to be said that maybe gatekeeping isn't the right way to go about it, or, to have kind of maybe a public awareness campaign so that people like Carol and Lauren would know the pros and cons of transitioning, the heavy medical burden that's associated with transitioning. That might be a more appropriate way to go at transitioning, as opposed to you have to go to psychiatrists and get signed off, because they've been learning this script since the 1960s. I think it was very innocent of Carol to come in without a script and to try and do it genuinely, and it reflects very well on you. But I think an awful lot of people just learn the script, and therefore it doesn't work, and public awareness would work better.
Yeah. Carol, what do you think about that, about the whole issue of therapy, and how much therapy is available for people who are thinking in terms of transitioning?
Yeah, that's kind of been my big thing that I advocate about now, is that there is no therapy for us. There is no therapy for people who have dysphoria. There just isn't. I mean, not in the United States. I can't speak for other countries, but here in California, yeah, you can go in and be, I mean, like when I went in, I was very honest about saying, I think I might be trans. I want help working it out. And that still wasn't helpful. I still didn't get any help working it out. And to talk about the gatekeeping, since I've had experiences kind of with both sides of this, I had experience with early gatekeeping and how that worked, and then had experience with pretty much just, affirmation only kind of stuff. Neither are good, because the gatekeeping in the beginning, what she required was that I live as a man for 6 months, meaning I needed to go by a male name. I needed to be in men's spaces, and all this stuff that it was impossible for me to do. I had large breasts I couldn't bind. I had a very female body. I had a high voice. There was no way I was going into men's spaces. And because of those requirements, I just dropped it, because I was just mad. I was upset. I was frustrated. But she also didn't really try to get to the root of any of my issues or question any of my issues. So I was left not having any help. I was left just to think that was the only way, and I couldn't do that way to feel better, which then ended up why years down the road it never resolved. It just kept building, so that I got to a point where I thought that was my only option. And even when I sought therapy, no one gave me any other options. I mean, ultimately, adults can do what they want. I'm not against people transitioning. Obviously, you do what you want when you're an adult. But I think if it's going to be a medical treatment, then there needs to be alternatives. Every medical treatment has an alternative. And why aren't we starting from the least invasive up to the most invasive? That makes no sense. Why would you just jump right into medical transition? And it is a big deal. And it does affect your health. I don't care what anybody says.
Thanks. I'm just looking at some of the questions here, and I'd like to ask Az, what about male to female dysphoria? Because we're dealing with women here this evening, because there's been such a huge increase in women. What about male to female dysphoria, Az? What could you say about that?
Well, I just wanted to quickly respond to a couple of things. One is there's a presumption that the general public have that if you seek a sex change, like insist on calling it that, is that you're going to have a degree of therapy before you have that. But that's a misnomer. That you don't. You just have to convince someone this is what you want. It's a bit like shopping. And to my awareness, I'm the only consultant psychiatrist in psychotherapy who specialises in gender dysphoria, and that's quite shocking, in that there isn't anyone else. So as Carol was saying, there aren't any exploratory therapies that she was aware of in the States, and Stella's doing it, yeah. But in terms of the medical profession, there is no other medical provision, and I totally agree with what Stella was saying about the conversion therapy. What we do know is that over 67% of children who are gender confused or gender dysphoric the natural course is for them to no longer have gender dysphoria as an adult. We know that, 67%, if you just let them carry on. But the risk is now that anyone with a gender dysphoria is shuttled along to the gender clinic and they're given this sort of chemical castration and stuff. And they're not allowed to end up becoming gay because they go on this sort of super highway of transness. And like a friend of mine said, it's like we're able to now to castrate all our gay children like we've always wanted to do, rather than allowing them to carry on and become gay. And it sounds quite provocative, but it's true, So I would agree with Stella in that the gender clinics are the conversion therapy. That people who would otherwise probably become gay, 67% of them, are becoming converted into something more acceptable.
Sorry, where do you get that figure from, Az?
So there's a study by Professor Richard Green. He used to be the head of the Gender Identity Clinic at Charing Cross, and he did a study which was unfortunately titled the Sissy Boy Study. And
very helpful.
Yes, and they followed up children. They were mainly boys who were gender dysphoric, and they showed that over 67% of them just didn't have a gender dysphoria at the end of it. They became gay men. And so, as you said, it used to be mainly males who were identifying as female, but now there's a huge influx of women. And I think that, Carol and Lauren articulately said, there's something about this new improved version of a lesbian that is a trans man. It's like, the Mark II model. The Mark I was a lesbian, Mark II is a trans man. Everything that Mark I had, but with other things,
I just
So
wanted
what did you ask me?
I can't remember what I asked you.
I had to go off on a tangent.
But I'm just looking at the questions, and two people have asked for recommended books so that they could learn more. Yeah, Az wants you to read his own book, which is very understandable, and has
it's also in Russian.
Well, so our Russian viewers will be able to read it in Russian, and other people perhaps. Anyway, so yes, Az's book was published in 2019. And Stella, what would you recommend for people who want to know more about gender dysphoria?
I'd certainly recommend Az's book. I read it and I thought it was very, really good. Fair play to you. I think the great two books from Heather Brunskell Evans and Michele Moore are really good. Born in the Wrong Body, is it called? Is the first one, and the second one is The Invention of the Transgender Kid. I probably got the titles wrong. They're over there, but they're really, really good. Really, really rate them.
That's Heather Brunskell Evans
and Michele
Moore, and
oh, of course, Abigail Shires.
Yeah.
How could I forget? Abigail Shires' Irreversible Damage. Really good analysis of what's going on to teenage girls.
Yeah, that's specifically about ROGD. Perhaps Stella, you could just explain
all with those four books.
Or maybe
yeah, ROG. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're having a little problem with the connection, Stella, but if you could explain the ROGD for people.
ROGD is a phenomenon that has been described originally by Lisa Litton at onset gender dysphoria, and it's from adolescents who never showed any signs of gender nonconforming, who suddenly, often after a trauma or after spending a long time online, become identified as trans, and they become very obsessive. They often have autism, they often have ADHD, they're often very high achieving, often have a lot of comorbidities. And it is arguable that people with ROGD are on a very different place than people who've had childhood gender dysphoria or even just gender dysphoria in general. They're in a different place, and it's a very, very highly contentious subject these days, because just like an awful lot of people with an awful lot of diagnosis, the one thing they don't want to be diagnosed with is gender dysphoria or ROGD. It's not a diagnosis, it's a description of a phenomenon that's happening at the moment, but it's very common.
I'm just looking at the questions, and so I've had a really difficult question from a trainee teacher who says that in the training they were taught that if they had any trans children in the class, they must affirm and use the preferred pronouns, and this is very much against this person's beliefs. And what should they do? It looks as if they might have to choose between their career and beliefs. And I don't know what advice we could possibly give to someone in a difficult situation like that. Stella?
Could I just say that I think there's a very bad misinterpretation of affirmative being taken here, and it's a very shallow interpretation, because I would always affirm anybody in front of me, especially a teenager, and this teacher affirm their person, affirm their experiences, affirm their validity of their feelings. It doesn't mean that they do everything that they are told to do by a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old.
Yeah, it's a particular, isn't it? It's a particular interpretation of what's affirmation, to affirm the gender instead of affirming.
Still reserve the right.
Yeah, and Lauren, do you feel that you were affirmed in a sense by the people around you as the person? How would you say that you were affirmed?
I wouldn't really say I recognized that whenever I was younger. My mum, when I was particularly young, she would have just accepted me just how I was. You know, I was very tomboyish, very, very into boy things. And she didn't question that, mainly because she had been a tomboy herself, but had just grown up to be very feminine. And so I don't think she thought to question anything to do with that or affirm me or anything like that. And when I began to struggle with my own sexed body, my sexed features and so on, I didn't tell a living soul. So, you know, nobody really at that time could have affirmed me. When I was an adult and I sought therapy, a few of the therapists I spoke to didn't know what dysphoria was. So in a sense, I'm almost glad they didn't affirm me, because if I had have been a child in struggling as I did and having what I would really class as an immature understanding of society and my body and what was going on, I would have taken any pill or surgery to be normal. I would have, you know, I would have done it. I would have taken the fix, and I would have swallowed anything that I was told if it meant that I could just be like everybody else.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of glad I didn't have affirmation.
Carol, I was thinking, I remember you saying before, talking about gender dysphoria or sex dysphoria. Do you, because I had a question also, somebody says, why do they call it gender dysphoria when it's really sex dysphoria? You're nodding as well. As what do you think, Carol? Because you call it sex dysphoria, do you?
Both. I mean,
what I mean, because somebody said it's not really your gender you're unhappy with, it's your sex. So why do, yeah.
For me, it's been both. I just do not like. I've had a lot of dysphoria around interacting with the world as a female and being a butch woman. But also, since I was a teenager, I've had a lot of issues with my biological sex, with my genitalia, with all of that goes along with it. I mean, Lauren talks about pregnancy being this kind of a positive thing for her. The idea of being pregnant horrified me. And even now I'm like, I could maybe be okay with it. But and she, when I first heard her story about this, it amazed me because that was not my perspective at all. And basically all the detrans women that I know, the idea of being pregnant is such a female thing that we run from it screaming, which is why when you are talking to trans or detrans females and you say things like, why would you want to transition? Because, you know, you could not be able to have children. You don't want to say that because we're like, yeah, that's exactly what we want. We don't want that part of being a female. Instead, I would like people to start to think about telling females, your uterus, your ovaries, those are important things that keep you healthy, that make you a whole healthy human. Has nothing to do with having babies. You know what I mean? Like it does, but that's not, it has a lot of function outside of that. Yeah, so to me, yeah. It was both.
Thank you. I've had a question. Somebody is asking whether that, and I suppose this is a question for Az or Stella, whether you, well, maybe actually it's a question for anybody, whether you can catch gender dysphoria, catch it from the internet, from online resources. Who wants to Az, you want to answer that?
So, I mean, because I was thinking, well, the different sort of groupings, if you had to have groupings of the gender dysphoria, you've got the internalized homophobia, you've got the people who I think are actually on the autistic spectrum, who are trying to find a meaning for why they're not quite right, and then sort of obsessed with frameworks. You've got going back to your question before, the male to female, there's a big proportion of them for which it's a sexualized, exciting, verging on the transvestite thing. But then with the kids, with the ROGD, why have you got this sudden influx of people becoming trans when they weren't trans last week? And my understanding of that is that it's the current day equivalent of what we had when we were kids, when we were a goth or a punk or a mod. We're all familiar with youth subculture, and youth subculture died when social media took off. You can track the decline and fall of youth subcultures, because when you were young in the 80s and 70s and 60s, you found a subculture that you could identify with and express yourself by and be subversive with. Social media meant that your identity was in social media. So you didn't have to be a goth or a punk or a mod or whatever it was. It all became about social media. I remember that when I went to school and Jenny turned up with massive backcombed hair and lots of makeup, within a week, we were all goths. I had bigger hair and more makeup than any trans child.
Oh, we need a picture of that, Az.
No, no one take anything I say seriously. And I looked more trans than anyone, but it wasn't about gender. It was very androgynous, asexual, and subversive. And I got banned from the local record shop because I looked too scary. My mother had to go and argue with them. But so in the absence of a subculture, being trans is a bit like being a goth. And of course, if your best friend is cool and trans, you're going to be cool and trans. It's I would say it's like a subculture that has unfortunately become medicalized. So rather than coming home and looking like an angry goth like I was, my parents going, "Oh, it's a phase, just ignore him." They're going, "Oh, you've got a medical condition. You better take to the specialist." And the way that doctors and psychologists are trained is to just have this tick box affirmative. Oh yes, okay, they're trans. Then they go along with it and they collude with it. And having worked at the GIDS clinic in Tavistock for a couple of years, that's all they were doing. There was no exploration, there's no questioning. And a huge swathe of my patients were post-operative regressors. And what they've all said was, why didn't anyone just say, what on earth are you talking about? What on earth are you thinking? Everyone was having this sort of affirmative, oh yes you are, because they'd done this sort of equality and diversity training, and there was no exploration, no questions asked. So they were sort of colluding with this idea. So this kid who would otherwise be a goth 20 years ago is now saying I'm trans. All the clinical people are going along with that, saying, oh yes, you're trapped in the wrong body, and they're fueling that. So it's actually just another youth subculture, which we have turned into a medical condition.
Well, yeah, I'm getting lots of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of the questions because we're going to be rounding up before too long. And some of the questions are very personal, very sort of specific. And I would invite you, if you're struggling with a particular problem you've presented here, you can send it to our email, because some of these things are really just not kind of questions we can deal with here. Somebody has asked if we have any idea about the percentages of people who regret transition, because it's always claimed that it's an infinitesimal percentage, but we don't have any. I don't know. Do we have any figures for the recent, like the last 10 years?
So we don't, for the simple reason that they do not follow anything up. If you go to hospital and have any intervention, like an ingrown toenail removed, there's some follow-up study where someone has done some boring research. The one intervention, even though it's quite a radical intervention, having a sex change, there is no follow-up studies. The one time they tried to do follow-up studies in Johns Hopkins, where they invented sex changes, they closed it down because the data wasn't good. So there's no follow-up. They keep spouting less than 1%, but none of my regretters have been followed up. They weren't in the statistics, so there is no known data. My service was just very specialist psychotherapy service. 26% of my patients were regretters, but that's a skewed sample of people who want therapy. So we don't know, but there's a silent population out there who are inconvenient to the whole LGBT sort of manifesto who don't have a voice, but increasingly, I'm glad to say, are having a voice. Officially, they don't exist because we're giving people what they want, but we don't know.
Thank you. I'm just saying somebody wants me to recommend Stella's podcast, Gender Through a Wider Lens, says it's a fantastic podcast. So thank you very much for that. I think that we're going to, I'll just take one more question here. Oh, and somebody says we must also recommend Stella's own book because she's too modest to do it herself, book called Fragile.
Thank you very much.
I'm just going to ask one more question then, and maybe anyone who wants to answer it. Somebody says, thanks to all the speakers, and this is a question for anyone who'd like to answer. What do you think the reasons are that the medical and therapeutical community in Carol's story was not offering more options and was not supportive of detransitioning? Aren't they the people who you'd expect to work with biological reality? Or is this a specifically American thing or not? So who would like to answer that? Why do you think they were not more, didn't offer more? Well, Carol wants to answer it herself. Okay. Sure.
In my experience, I think a lot of it has to do with the science has been completely thrown out. It's a political movement, and the lobby and the political side of it has a ton of money. And they've pressured the medical community into doing what they want. So it's the patients telling the medical community, hey, give me what I want. And the medical community's like, okay.
But do you think it's because, of course, there's so much commercial interest in the United States? Well, that's very different, I think, from the situation in the UK and Europe, because the patient is kind of the consumer. Is that fair to say? Or
yeah,
not?
I mean, our medical system is a complete disaster over here. So, and every state is different. But I can speak for California in that it is a very, it's very for-profit. So obviously you have the pharmaceutical companies really putting a lot of money into the pockets of a lot of the trans lobbies as well. There's been different articles pointing that out and showing that, and I think that's very interesting because the pharmaceutical companies, the main ones giving out or producing testosterone, estrogen, things like that, they've already been sued multiple times because of not just because they've not had good studies behind the side effects of testosterone. For example, like men who were given testosterone, they sued one of the pharmaceutical companies and won. So it's like a lot of these pharmaceutical companies don't even give the hormone replacement stuff to actual people who might need it anymore, like they used to, because they've been sued. So I think now they might be moving on to trying to find a new clientele.
Jesus.
Yeah, well, this is always quite depressing. I want to end with one question that I'd like everybody to answer. We are here at LGB Alliance. Is it fair to say that gender dysphoria is to some extent an LGB issue? Az?
Going back to the statistic of 2/3 of boys who are gender confused in childhood end up being gay men, yes, because what you're doing is it's like a sexuality cleansing. It's like you're trying to eradicate these people who'd otherwise be gay and by making them into trans people. So I would say yes, and also sociopolitically, the whole point of the LGB Alliance is the wish for independence of sexualities from gender identity, because they're completely different. And I on Twitter I'm getting all these people saying, "Oh, the LGB is transphobic," and like, for example, the Welsh nationalists and the Scottish nationalists are accusing the LGB of being transphobic, and I was saying, well, as a Scottish independence advocate or a Welsh independence advocate, you recognise the importance of independence. You don't hate the English and the Irish, and you want independence. You don't hate them. You're not phobic of them. We want independence, but we're not hating and phobic of them. And it's very simplistic to think that. And why would I devote a career to working with gender dysphoria if I was phobic or hated? And I remember I used to have 13 pages of Google hatred saying this evil Nazi psychiatrist, conversion. And my gender dysphoria patient was going, are they talking about you? Because you seem quite nice. Okay, yeah, I'm quite nice. But
Thanks,
yeah.
Stella, is
Yeah.
gender dysphoria an LGB issue?
It very much is, because children who are same-sex attracted, who up until recently could have been prescribed puberty blockers in the UK and Ireland, and certainly in America that it's ongoing, their burgeoning sexuality is blocked when they get puberty blockers. And therefore, so they might have thought maybe I like boys or girls, and they don't know it because they're 11, and their sexuality is blocked, and it's a key point. And therefore, you could say it's almost homophobic to give puberty blockers, because any sexuality, it's certainly sexual phobic, because any sexuality is being blocked. And that's a real issue, that people who allow their children to have puberty blockers don't realize you're blocking their sexuality. And that sexuality might be the problem.
We're doing what we did to like Alan Turing in the war, but to kids. And we're saying, oh, isn't it terrible what we did to Alan Turing, the homosexuals in the war? There are films about it, but we're doing it to our children, and we're calling it treatment. It's the same thing, it's the same drug,
Thanks. And I want to ask Carol. I'm going to ask Carol the same question. Carol, is this an LGB issue?
Oh yes, especially among lesbians, because I don't know. You can talk to any lesbian now and ask, where's all the butch lesbians? Oh, they transitioned. Like, so many. It's really just very pervasive in the lesbian community. And I did a little research a while ago where I kind of looked up all the famous lesbians for the last 10 years. I think maybe one or two are still identifying as lesbian. They all either have transitioned or they identify as non-binary. So there's something happening here.
This is what we call a lesbian erasure, and this is why we focus so strongly on this issue. Lauren, is this an LGB issue?
Yes, very much so. Since co-founding the LGB Alliance Ireland last year, I have had so many conversations with so many people, not just lesbian, gay men, bisexuals, but straight women and men who have suffered from the condition. So, I just wanted to remind everybody that transgender is a way of identifying yourself. Dysphoria it's not fussed about who it affects. It can affect children, it can affect old people, it can affect women and men. It doesn't matter who you are, It's just that I don't think there's just one way of treating it. I think to say that there's just one way to treat it and is incorrect.
Well, this has just been a fantastic discussion, and I want to tell everybody that that this webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel. So if you missed part of it, or you'd like to see it again, you'll be able to see it there. That we will also post the titles of the books and the podcast that we mentioned, so that you'll be able to look them up afterwards, and we'll post them to YouTube and perhaps also on Twitter. And I just want to thank all of you. We just appreciate the openness and the honesty. We don't often see discussions about this subject, and I think we need more. I hope everyone who attended the webinar enjoyed it as much as we did. And if we didn't get around to answering your question, some of them were specific. You could send them in by email, and we'll do our best to answer them if we can. And I want to invite everyone to sign up to our mailing list, and you'll receive a notification of our next webinar on February the 25th, which will be, appropriately enough, for LGBT History Month, about LGB history. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.